All right. Yeah, finally. Wow. So let me begin by first giving you a sort of little bit of an outline here. Is that my good friend Russ Shalom helped put together this slides onto the PowerPoint, and Russ is now operating the MRV camera. Thank you very much, Russ. I would have been lost without Russ with this. And as with all things computer, I would also be lost without my colleague and friend Clay Westbrook, who's now on the floor. And he is going to be running the computer and moving that. I would also say that I would not have been able to go to Alaska and fulfill a lifelong dream had it not been for the support of my wife, who on several occasions people asked her, well, what do you think about George going away for 4 months? And she said, this has been a dream of his for a long time, and I'm happy for him to go. And what a perfect response. And so thank you, by the way. One of the questions, by the way, for those of you who don't have a great view, my apologies. Anyways. It's sort of shallow. But one of the things that's fascinating is why Alaska? Why bother? And this idea that my father planted in my head 40-some years ago, when he was about my age now. He was recently retired. He and my mother took a dream vacation to Alaska. They flew from Connecticut to Seattle and then took the Inland Passage boat up to Skagway took about a week, and then took a train over to Whitehorse, Yukon Territory, and then got on one of those bubble buses, and they were with a group of 40 other retirees and worked their way north to Dawson City, and then to Fairbanks, down the Parks Highway to Denali National Park, ending up in Anchorage 3 weeks later, where they flew home. And when my father returned, he was things that he had done and seen. At the time, I was about 23 or 24 years old, and I remember he's sitting at the dining room table with the morning sun coming in where he always sat, and he paused and he looked up at me and he said, if you ever get a chance, go to Alaska. And of all the many things that my father said to me that I've long forgotten, that was one of the things that happened to stay. And then about 18 or 20 years ago, there was a customer here at Flatbread who I had become friendly with, and I hadn't seen him all summer. I saw him again in the fall, and I said, his name is Clay. I said, nice to see you, Clay. Where have you been? And he said, I've been up in Alaska. I did a VIP, a Volunteers in Parks program, where he worked as a research assistant at one of the national parks, and he camped, and they fed him and provided him housing, and he was up there for a couple of months. And as I thought about that, I said, that strikes me as a much more interesting way to go to Alaska than to simply tour around on a bus. And so that became the model for my trip. That's a longer period of time, and it's, of course, hard in modern American life to take larger blocks of time off. And so it was easy to kind of keep postponing that. And about 6 years ago, I was turning 59, and I kept thinking about the Alaska trip, and I said to myself, if I'm ever going to do this, I need to do it before I'm physically unable or mentally unwilling. And once again, life intervened. The kids were graduating from high school and then college, and then last year we had the big barn restoration project. And as that project was wrapping up last fall, I started thinking about 2017, and I thought, maybe this could be the year. And that if I'm going to do this, that I need to start telling people and, as soon as possible to kind of throw my hat over the wall before I know I could climb it. And so I started telling people here at work and at home, and all of whom were supportive. And there was a moment in the planning process where I paused and I said, you know, there's so many worthwhile things to do at Lareau Farm and in the Mad River Valley that I will not be able to do because of this time away. And I then thought, you know, there's always going to be worthwhile and good things to do at Lareau Farm in the Mad River Valley. And will I get to a place in my life later where I'm unable to go for either physical or mental or financial reasons and live with that regret? And so that was a turning point, and I went forward with my planning. And the photographs and stories that you will see now are a result of that commitment. This is Selby Lake in the gates of the Arctic National Park, about 50 miles north of the Arctic Circle, where I spent 8 weeks. This is the main lodge. I didn't live in the main lodge. There was another smaller cabin, which we will see. But the journey now begins in Anchorage. Here's a little map of that area. Looks familiar. We can go to the next one. My plane landed in Anchorage. I left on the 15th of May, which was would have been my father's 110th birthday, very intentionally. And then I had about three and a half weeks on my own in sort of the southern parts of Alaska. I was hiking and camping and canoeing and exploring all places that I had researched during the course of the winter. And then I moved on to Manly Hot Springs on June 7th. Next slide, please. This is the first thing that I saw when I landed at the Anchorage airport. The coastal mountains are really quite magnificent. Slide. And this is not a great picture, but this is the Alaskan Range from the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. These is part of the Alaskan Range near Mount McKinley or Denali, as it's now called. This is Mount Denali, which is a little bit rare. This mountain is only visible about 60 days a year. It is a little over 20,000 feet high, as many of you know. And what's really unique about the mountain is that it rises from an elevation of about 2,000 feet. So in the American Rockies, most of the high mountains in Colorado are start at very high bases of 8,000 or 9,000 feet. And so the difference or the drop is relatively shallow compared to Denali, which rises about 18,000 feet above the valley floor. Next slide, please. One of the things we did in preparation for this show was that we dropped in professional photographs that we downloaded from the internet, because I just had a little camera. And so this is a professional photograph of Denali because everybody wants to see what it looks like by the pros. And there's a couple of others like that. This is a place that I stayed at for 3 or 4 nights in Talkeetna, a very cool little town. Next slide, please. That is the jumping off place for most of the ascents to Mount McKinley. Typical wetland of Alaska, lots of wetlands. This is Seward on a cloudy day. I bought rubber boots in there. Here are the 2 women that I bought the rubber boots from. And the one had just finished high school and the other was just finishing her first year in college. I went to this national park, next slide, where you can see a glacier. And this is the glacier next slide please, in significant retreat. This is where the glacier was in 1926, and it is a classic example of the retreats of glaciers that are happening virtually all over the world. Next slide please. Say it again?
What was the temperature when you arrived?
It was cool. When it was overcast, it would be in the 40s and 50s. This is in the middle of May. This is a little village of Hope, which is 80 miles from Anchorage. Next slide, please. But only 2.5 miles by water. Very historic. A lot of these old historic towns were really, next slide, please, about the gold mining. So this is a little museum, a historic area. Lovely construction. Next slide. And this is the hostel that I stayed in the first night. Next slide, please. In downtown Anchorage. Oil is a really big deal in Alaska. It is the principal driver of the economy. Next slide, please. And this is the largest building in Anchorage. This is a guy who I bought stainless steel wire from, and I was looking for wire to hold salmon onto a cedar plank. And so he says, well, how much do you need? And I said, 10 feet. So he went to the back room, got the wire, came back out. I said, well, what do I owe you? And he said, it's not worth the paperwork. Just get out of here. Next slide, please. I went to Alaska Native Heritage Center. Next slide, please. They've rebuilt housing that's typical of the different tribes. Next slide, please. In Alaska. These are from the southeast. Next slide. And next slide. And these are whale bones. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. These are like typical boats. These kind of structures, these often called cache, were built to keep food away from the bears. The bears are a really big deal. They really dominate a lot of both construction and the psychology of being outside. Next slide, please. Alaskan mountains, I don't know where that's. Beautiful, it's beautiful. Next slide, please. They all start looking this a little bit the same. So Alaska is an all wilderness. Next slide, please. And this is in Wasilla. Wasilla is famous because of Sarah Palin. Yeah, this is Sarah Palin's home. This is Tim and Christina's home. Tim is the brother of a woman who vacations here in the Mad River Valley, and they were kind enough to introduce me. This is a lake. I think this is a lake that they see from their vacation home. Next slide, please. And so I stayed with them for 3 or 4 nights. This is Tim, lovely guy. He does marketing, lovely guy. Next slide, please. Was what I was. And there's his wife. She is a full-blood Native woman who went to Dartmouth and now is helping Alaska. Imagine getting internet all over into rural Alaska. Next slide, please. This is the canoe that I used on my canoe trip. After leaving their home, I went to Nancy Lake State Recreation Area, where there are a chain of lakes with portages and trails and little cabins called public use cabins that you can rent. And I had signed up online for that, and this was the canoe that I rented. Next slide, please. And these are the people that I rented it from. The canoe I had was actually his personal canoe, and that was very fortunate. It was smaller. The regular canoes would have crushed me. This was heavy enough. The portages were hard, long, and this is my first camp in Lynx Lake. Well, you know, that didn't last, by the way. This is the public use cabin. It was lovely. It'll have little wood stove, which I used every night because it was chilled. Next slide, please. A little cabin near the lake that's a professional drop in. Next slide. Aren't they nice? This is the signage for this canoe trail. Next slide, please. These echo ponds were the most beautiful that I went through. It was just lovely. Next slide, please. The forest, of course, is different, a lot more spruce and birch and aspen. This is a typical of how the state is built. Walkways, next slide, please, over soft or wet land. Just a sort of an interesting cloud formation. Next slide. This is something that you see commonly around cabins that are not used all the time, and this is to keep bears from beating on the windows and doors. Next slide, please. This is an example of the dieback that they're experiencing from, I think it's spruce budworm in parts of Alaska. So you can see the spruce trees have died, and the aspens are still in good shape. Javits Lake was one of the lakes.
George, the spruce beetle, is that native or is it?
Yeah, it is. Next slide, please. This is a beaver lodge, and what was interesting is that the beavers there don't seem to have to bother building the lodges on islands or isolated or surrounded by water. They just sort of build them along the bank. Next slide, please. And they also largely didn't seem to have to build dams because there was so much still water available. Sort of typical of what the state provides for your food to keep bears out. Next slide, please. So this was towards the end of the third week in July, and this is a portage of this pond, and I said, oh, there's a little bit of skim ice. I'm just going to go there and break right through there. So I loaded up the canoe and went out there, and the ice was over a foot thick. Next slide, please. So it was an extra portage. This is where I met Helen and Mike in Talkeetna, and I took this shot on the first time to Talkeetna before, and I saw them on the second time. Next slide, please. Lovely place, really successful. This is Talkeetna, sort of the downtown village is a bunch of log cabins. It's charming. It's touristy. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is all part of the Talkeetna village. Next slide, please. This is an old, can we go back to that one? This is an old, this was a building that was in a different part of town. They moved it to this end of town, and this is a legal cannabis shop. So Alaska had just changed its laws, and so they were experimenting with it. Next slide, please. Some of the places are beautiful, some are wrecks. I thought this was fabulous, is that this Alaska has more drownings than maybe any other state. They have a lot of bodies of water, but the other thing that's an issue is that the water is super cold. And so if you go in the water and you don't have a life jacket, it's really problematic. And they were finding that kids were dying, and so they took it upon themselves to put these signs and have free life jackets at virtually every public put-in, which I thought was just a lovely solution to a really heartbreaking problem. Next slide, please. This is a guy that I met on the trail at Denali State Park. Lovely guy. Next slide. I've documented these names. This is self-portrait. There's my shadow. Next slide, please, on a stone that I hung out by. This is up on an open ridge in Denali State Park, which Denali State Park, of course, is nowhere near as famous as the national park, but in this state park, on this open ridge, you have these magnificent views of the Alaskan Range and Mount Denali. Of course, it was cloudy the day I was there, but still lovely. Next slide, please. This is a couple that I met along the trail, and they gave me homemade cured jerky that was absolutely delicious. Next slide, please. This is an example from the ridge looking out, and there's the Alaska Range in the back. You can see the clouds. You can still see there was snow up there. And these rivers have these big open valleys, and they get braided. And there's a lot of water in these rivers, and they're all braided, and they're full of gravel. And it's really powerful habitat for those lives that live in that kind of water environment. And it's just something, the scale of which we simply do not see really here in the East. Next slide, please. This is part of the open ridge that I was on, that I hung out here for a couple of hours reading and writing and just hanging out. I leaned against this rock. Next slide, please. And it started snowing. And, I was dressed for it and it was okay. Just a kind of a little picture of the next slide, please, of the canopy. Lots and lots of water features, really lovely. Next slide, please. So many, we downloaded that. No, I didn't take that picture. But hey, tonight, everybody, he loves the big animals, Next slide. Yeah, I took that picture. That's a moss and the water was delicious, by the way. This was coming down over this pristine hill. Next slide, please. This was a great group of young people that I met along the way, and they were working for the summer in a place called Glitter Gulch, which is this commercial area right outside of Denali National Park. A nice bridge that the state had built. Next slide, please. This is again all in Denali State Park. Next slide, please. This is Briar Lake, where I stayed. An excellent Alaskan outhouse built by the state. So you can see how clean it is. Next slide, please. This is the cabin. This is the public use cabin that I rented, and you can see the living roof. Next slide, please. Beautiful craftsmanship in the woodwork. This was a high school group at a hostel where I stayed in a tent on a cold night. And these are kids that were come from New Jersey, and they were on like a 2-week trip as part of an outward bound kind of educational experience. I actually did take that photograph, part of the Alaskan Range. Next slide, please. Good job. Yeah, another one. Next slide, please. But this is end of May. I took this picture, actually, and this is in Denali National Park. It's a classic picture of a sow bear and a cub. This is in Denali National Park. Not a great shot, but you can kind of get a sense of the scale of it. And again, these valleys always have these braided rivers in them that are full of gravel and lots of interesting habitat. And nobody picks up the dead trees and stuff, and all that stuff comes down and creates interesting habitat for lots of organisms, which is helpful. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Just sort of, this is the Denali Road, the one road in the park. Next slide, please. And this is the only way you get into the park, which is nice in that it doesn't get congested with all the private cars like Yellowstone can be. And another downloaded shot. But it was Doll Sheep that was the principal reason why Denali National Park was established, was to protect this resource. These are downloaded shots. This might be my shot, and this is a downloaded shot. I went to an area outside of Fairbanks where it was like an educational small forest, and they were talking about the boreal forest. And I think this was a sort of an interesting shot of looking at this habitat that circles the pole. And this is the largest single habitat type in the world in terms of acreage. Next slide, please. Another beautiful shot of the Alaskan Range. Next slide, please. This is where, in Denali National Park, where I camped for the first night. I had a backcountry camping permit, and this was my jumping off place. And it was from here that I walked down a creek, essentially going the wrong way. And it was where I had my first encounter with a grizzly bear along that brook, which I wrote about and shared in the Valley Reporter in my first email. And I was going down the creek, following the creek, because one of the things about Denali that's so different than the national parks here in the lower 48 is they have an ethic of no trails. And the whole idea was that when you go into the backcountry, that is to experience the wilderness in its purest form. And so I was using the creek as a trail, as a way to guide myself into this wilderness area. And when you follow the creek, sometimes the brush gets really thick, so you go into the woods and then you come around and you kind of wiggle as the creek goes down. And so it had been in the woods, and I was coming back towards the creek. And as I came to the creek, I stopped, and immediately this grizzly bear came on the other side about 70 feet away and took a drink of water, looked up and saw me. And so then it walked across the creek to the side that I was on. So then I walked to the other side of the creek. Too smart. And then the grizzly bear walks back That's my side. And I'm like, oh, this is weird. And so then, so I started just sort of backing and curving away. The grizzly stayed near the creek, and it was just rooting around in the ground for the roots and leaves that it eats that time of year. And eventually I felt like I got far enough away where I could turn my back and just keep walking, and basically it was a non-event. And one of the things that the Park Service has done a really good job with is to inform people who go into the backcountry about the protocols and safety precautions in and around the backcountry, much of which is about bears, but some of which is simply about stream crossings. And so the protocol for bears is to stand your ground, to raise your hands and make yourself look larger, to speak clearly but not with that aggravated or nervous voice, to communicate that you're a human being. Human beings are not naturally prey for grizzly bears, and to never run. And then there's other protocols if the bear gets too close. Their whole goal is to have people be safe and have bears be safe. Because if the bears and people have bad interactions, typically what that means is that they have to put that bear down. They have to hunt it and kill it. And that's not their goal in the management of the park. And they don't want people to get hurt. And so the bear biologists have developed these protocols that really help minimize the negative interactions between people and bears. The other really big deal is to not associate people with food for the bears. And so you're to keep your food at least 100 yards from your tent, and keep it in a bear-proof canister. And you're actually not supposed to have your clothes that you cooked your food in near your tent. It turns out that I went into the camping area with almost no food, no cooking. I didn't want to create those odors and have that in and around my camp. I was only going in for 2 nights, so that worked out pretty well. Next slide, please. This is the creek. This is the creek where I saw the grizzly bear. So you can see this is sort of typical of the country. I mean, it's, next slide, please. So on the next day, I camped at a different spot out in this open tundra, and that was in the 3rd morning when I got out of my tent is when I looked to the east, and in the distant tundra, there was this rolling tundra framed by these beautiful mountains. I mean, it was just lovely. And in the distance, maybe a half a mile or so away, I saw a grizzly bear kind of loping through the tundra, and I'm thinking, oh, that's beautiful. You know, it feels safe and everything. And then I turned to the north, and there was a grizzly bear looking at me. It was about 150 feet away. And I'm like, whoa. One of the other protocols that they tell you is don't hike alone. That wasn't possible for me. It was usually supposed to be in groups of 3 or more. But so being alone is less safe by definition. So I followed the protocols. All my food was away. I raised my hands. I spoke. And the bear basically, and I was standing out in the front of my tent, and the bear basically just made a big circle around my tent. And as the bear moved, I moved with it just to keep facing it. And eventually, it was about 10, 15 minutes maybe, it finally made its way around and then walked back out into the wilderness. And after the bear left, I said, you know, maybe I don't need to eat my breakfast here. So I just packed up and I hiked out to the road to meet the bus, which was the day I was meeting the bus anyways. And this is where I sat to eat my breakfast. Next slide, please. This is sort of typical of some of the brush that I had to walk through. These is alder and willow. And these thickets were intense. Next slide, please. You can see that the leaves aren't out yet. Next slide, please. Just beautiful open lands and forested lands. Next slide, please. You can see, this is sort of interesting, the scattering. You know, it's like a park-like scattering of trees and brush and open tundra. It was lovely. Next slide, please. Well, I had maps, and I have a sort of a pretty good internal compass. So I used, mostly I used my internal compass. And I would look for landmarks along the way and sort of guide myself that way. This was my tent where I saw the bear. So that was sort of the countryside that I was in. And this is this open tundra with the scattered trees and these snow-capped mountains in the background, which was in Denali National Park where the bears were. Next slide, please.
George, you haven't mentioned mosquitoes yet.
Interestingly, so now we're in the end of May, near the end of May, and mosquitoes aren't out yet. So I'm walking around, I go, man, what's this big deal about the Alaskan mosquitoes? The mosquitoes came later. Next slide, please. So this is the bear scat that the bear left for me on his circle around. He stopped, and that was, next slide, please. It's enough of that. This is a lovely woman that I met while I was waiting for the bus when I was eating my breakfast there at that cabin. And she was a fisheries biologist. She was on 3 days off. And her studies were looking and identifying streams and waterways in Alaska that support andromedous fish, or fish that move from freshwater to saltwater. And what they were trying to do was catalog all of those waterways to try then to protect those waterways, to protect that important fishery. Because those fisheries, which is largely salmon but not exclusively salmon, is economically really important. Next slide, please. She also, just parenthetically, is that in the wintertime, she lives in the Berkshires in Massachusetts and takes care of her grandmother, who is elderly. Next slide, please. Oh, this is Stiles Brook. This is the place that I hiked to. It was a rough 7 muddy miles uphill. And when I got there was no water. And this is where I had to walk about a half a mile. And I finally found some bog water that I put in my microfilter, which I have over in the other room. And so I'm leaning down, and this puddle was a puddle. And so I'm looking down, and right next to the water is this big moose droppings. And I'm like, oh man, so it was good to have the microfilter, and I got the microfilter at Clearwater Sports. There's a plug, and I did not get sick. This is the Chena River. So we're in the Chena River State Recreation Area, which was a beautiful place. This is a place that I had applied to for a state parks job, and I got this other job before, which I committed to, and about a month later, I heard from the superintendent, and he said, oh, I saw your application, I'd like to offer you an assistant ranger's position. And I said, well, that's nice, I've already made this other commitment. So this was an area that I had identified as an area of interest, and I really wanted to visit this, and I spent several days at the Chena River State Recreation Area. Next slide, please. This is at Chena Hot Springs. It was a little resort. This is a place where they're generating electricity with hot water, and they are heating all of their greenhouses and all of their buildings with water from the hot spring. This is at the end of about a 60-mile road outside, east of Fairbanks. Next slide, please. There's a little story called Notes from Red Squirrel Camp, and this is Red Squirrel Camp, this lovely little pond. And this is a tent that I borrowed from my friend Dave Reed. Next slide, please. It's like a one-man tent. This is the Museum of Natural History and Art at the University of Alaska. Lovely place, controversial building. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Self-portrait. Next slide, please. Next slide. The detail. That's the other half. Next slide, please. Next. Russ, did I put in too many of these? This is Chena River, really typical of the gravel banks that you see in Alaska. Next slide, please. This is Willow coming. Next slide, please. These are the mountains in the Chena State Recreation Area, much more like the mountains. They reminded really of New Hampshire, but sort of like in the northern Appalachian Mountains. It was a lovely area. This state park, by the way, is 375 square miles. about 250,000 acres. This was one of the tracks that I went up. A lot of ATVs are used in this park. Next slide, please. One of the things that I found is that in Alaska, Alaskans seem to hang on to all their stuff, and they don't always have a good place to put it. Landfills are far away, and so this was I stayed in a cabin. This guy was like an old sourdough. Next slide, please. And he just had like junk and stuff, and he had like thousands of pieces of stuff. Next slide, please. And this is the cabin that I stayed in for 2 nights. Next slide, please. And this was a little cache that they had there. Next slide, please. This was an original 160-acre homestead. In the bar, he had this 4-foot-long wood stove, and it was like what's called a real sourdough bar. It was funky. It had hides on it, and it was all logs. It was, next slide, please. And there would be like 4 customers. Next slide, please. Because there wasn't anybody around. Next slide, please. This is sort of the interior of this sourdough cabin. Another beaver lodge that took over the trail. And this was going up to the granite tors. Next slide, please. So these are the granite tors, which are in Chaina River State Recreation Area. And this is an interesting story of magma coming up in this bubble that's about 5 miles wide and 15 miles long. And so this is a much harder material that was eroded. And the presence of these tors is given as evidence that the interior of Alaska was never glaciated, and as a result could have been the passageway for people traveling from Siberia into the New World over the Bering Land Bridge. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. These are the tors. Next slide, please. They're beautiful. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Wildflowers. So I'm walking down from the tours, and I met these college kids, and they're all like sunbathing or something, and they're carrying beer up the mountain, and they were waiting for a couple of women that were in their party that were a little further on. So they were just hanging out, eating goldfish and drinking beer. Next slide, please. So this is Bernie Carl. Bernie Carl is at the Chaina River, Chaina Hot Springs, and this is a guy that is sort of the energy and the ideas behind the hot water, electricity, and the greenhouses and all that. And he's got, and so this structure here were 5-gallon plastic pails that he had ideas to hydroponically grow vegetables out of. And his dream was to have one of these in every classroom in America to help kids reconnect with their own food. Next slide, please. Bernie Carl once said that, he said, I overheard him say that when somebody asked him, how you doing? He goes, I've never had a bad day. And he would speak in funny ways like that. And one of the things that he said was, it's a work in progress. I find that if you do not work, you do not make any progress. So he would say stuff like that. These are his greenhouses. This is an ice house. So you can sleep in here. You can have a cocktail in here. This is all refrigerated to 20 degrees by the power of the electricity that's generated by the hot water. Next slide, please. These are 2 people. This is effective aging. See that? These are 2 people that worked at the front desk of the Pink Hotel in Fairbanks. There I stayed several nights. Next slide, please. They were all very friendly and pleasant. Now I'm leaving Fairbanks. It is June 7th, and I have been in Alaska for a little over 3 weeks, and I am driving my rental car, which prohibits me to drive on a dirt road, 164 miles, half of which is a dirt road, to Manly Hot Springs, north and west of Fairbanks. Next slide, please. This is the cabin that I lived in at Manly Hot Springs. about 14 by 20 with a front porch. And in a typical way, they had the freezer and the crap outside. This is the main house, and we had an extension cord from the main house over here that provided 2 light bulbs. Next slide, please. There was a little wood stove. This is the church, and I went to church here 4 times, 3 times in June and then once in August when I returned. A little log cabin of a church. The congregation at Sunday 11 a.m. service was typically about 12, 14 people. There was a visiting pastor who had flown in for the summer. He was a minister at different places around the country and around the world at different times of the year, and he had come back to Manly each summer for the last 14 years. His name was Dave. He was a lovely guy. They were Pentecostal, and so there was a very strict interpretation of the Bible, was their sensibilities. There was singing from hymns, although there wasn't any musical instruments. And Dave had just the most lovely spirit about him. And that really touched me. And a couple of weeks into my time at Manly, I was going by on the road, and I saw him walking by the bridge. And next slide, please. And I said, "Oh, would you ever be willing to sit down and have a talk with me about spirit?" And he said, "Yeah, I'd be happy to." And so we did that the next day in the Manly Roadhouse on a Sunday evening. These 2 big windows had this beautiful afternoon, evening light. This Roadhouse dated from 1903 and was typical of the kind of bars and hotels that were built in Alaska at the turn of the century to support travelers around the gold mining. This area had a lot of gold mining. Next slide, please. This is the bridge. Next slide, please. I pronounced it slough. Slough, and it's pronounced slough. And this is what the slough looks like when the water is low. Next slide, please. And this is what passes for sanitary landfill. Basically, they just dug a big trench, and then this thing is the back of a big steel furnace, kind of like giant wood stove. And people would throw their trash in there. One of the things that I really struggled with, and I tried not to bring my agenda to Alaska, but to go there to listen and to learn, to be respectful of what I saw without a lot of judgment. This really stretched me, but one of the things that was really common is that they burned plastic here. And the plastic bags would go in, and et cetera, et cetera. And of course, burning plastic creates dioxin, which is one of the most carcinogenic chemicals that we know. So that wasn't great, but next slide, please. This is on the way to Eureka, which is a gold mining district, and not too far from Manly. Next slide. And these are the spoilings, or the gravel that comes out of the creek from gold mining. Next slide, please. And these are scattered all around. So you saw these kinds of signs around a lot, and starting in 1971, but then it got further codified in 1980, there was a native land settlement happened, and native tribes formed corporations, and the corporations were allocated land. And so this is a native corporate land holding. I want to say that in total, the native corporate land holdings, and there's something like 13 corporations around the state, total something like 44 million acres. So it's a lot of land, and it has helped native people retain some of their traditional ways of living and hunting and gathering food. This is typical of the forest fire damage that is very common. The interior of Alaska can get very dry in the summer, particularly in June and July. Is their next slide, please? Their fire season. This is in the town of Minto, where this is sort of their version of a roadhouse, sort of a newer thing. Minto was a native village that was on the edge of a gigantic wetland that was very, very productive and a historic hunting and trapping and fishing grounds. And this is sort of some of the infrastructure that they have there. Next slide, please. This is Minto. Yep. This is a. This is sort of some of the newer housing in Minto. And this is virtually all native housing. This is part of the wetland. Next slide, please. It was difficult to really capture this, but here's a little bit of a sense of this. And the scale of this is not at all like anything that we see in the east. I mean, this wetland probably is in the order of hundreds of square miles. Next slide, please. This is the road to Minto and to Manly Hot Springs. Next slide, please. Self-portrait. Next slide, please. I realized that instead of taking these shadows, that I could take a picture in the mirror. Next slide, please. The Yukon River is the Dalton Highway. Of course, is the highway that takes you up to the oil fields at Purdue Hole. This was a woman this is the bear. This is a picture of the bear that she shot, and that's the bear rug that she has on the wall on this little store that seemed to be open about 3 hours a day, about 40 days a year. Next slide, please. Here is the famous Alaskan pipeline. And you can see in this section it's underground. Here it comes above ground, and it has this little jog in it. And the above ground is about to protect the permafrost, and because the pipe runs hot. And secondly, the jogging has to do with creating flexibility for earthquakes. This is a very seismically active area. And so there were huge engineering issues to build this thing. This is just outside of Fairbanks. These fins were specially designed to dissipate heat so that these posts that were driven into the permafrost didn't melt the permafrost. Next slide, please. The pipe is 4 feet in diameter. There's 2 of them. At their peak in the late 80s, they carried 2 million barrels a day. They're currently carrying in the order of 600,000 barrels a day, which is really constraining the finances of state government. State government runs almost entirely on oil royalty revenues. They currently have no state income tax, no sales tax, and no real estate taxes. There are some taxes in some of the bigger cities, but largely it's a virtually tax-free environment because of oil revenues. That is getting compromised now because the pipeline is only carrying about 30% of its peak. And interestingly, less oil going through is actually creating more maintenance issues. And so there are real challenges of what all this means in the long term. They continue to find oil up on the North Slope. It's really expensive oil to get out. So at $40 a barrel, it's probably not competitive. This is my place. No, this is just a cabin that I found this is in Manly Hot Springs. This is sort of like an abandoned joint. Yeah, some of the places, you think of like an Alaska cabin and you have all these kind of idealized visions, and some of them are just terrible. Next slide, please. This is a place up on stilts, which I thought was an odd construction. This guy had a log cabin base for his greenhouse, and he had his own lumber mill. Unfortunately, this guy had passed away, and now his wife was trying to sell it, and it was like a giant mess of a place. Next slide, please. So I took some images, next slide, please, that I just sort of liked the geometry of the images. Next slide, please. I see that we're a little off the screen. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
So George,
Next slide, please.
the natural beauty of Alaska is spectacular, but all of the architecture that we've seen so far seems incredibly base. And I'm wondering, did you see any kind of thing with design integrity, or aside from that museum that you showed us?
Well, certainly there were some beautiful small cabins. And the modern stuff often wasn't very compelling. It's a tricky environment to build in because of the permafrost, because of cost constraints. And there's a kind of like, oh, it doesn't matter because everything else is so nice, maybe. So, and it's just, the fact is that, and I think this barn is an example, is that the beauty, part of the beauty of this is that it was built by people over 100 years ago, and they built it with a different aesthetic, perhaps, and different tools, and a different sense of time. And almost all of Alaska is brand new. So the telephone poles were falling over, and they just braced them up. Next slide, please. This is the work that I did in exchange for my room and board in Manly Hot Springs. I filled this woodshed, and the wood of choice is white birch. And I was really fastidious about getting them perfectly lined up. And next slide, please. This is all hand cut. I cut the trees, I bucked them, loaded them into the all-terrain vehicle wagon, brought them out of the woods 5 miles, unloaded them, stacked them. I split them by hand, and then had to stack it into here. And because I was cutting it in June, the bark was all popping off, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm not getting credit for the volume of space that this bark would have taken. So I had to put more wood in, but so be it. But anyways, I filled the woodshed. This was where I slept, and that was my reading light. Next slide, please. This was the desk. This is a card that my daughter sent to me. Next slide, please. This is one of the notebooks that I showed over here. Next slide, please. Just crap on the wall. There's a sort of a, next slide, please, an experimental place, I guess. This is sort of typical of small commercial fishing boat. So the guy builds a little shelter for himself. And then you can go out onto the Tanana River, which was very close, the largest tributary to the Yukon, and I think the second largest river in the state. It's a huge river. And salmon run there along with other fish. Next slide, please. This is me canoeing on the slough, which is sort of a backwater of the Tanana River. Next slide, please. This is just beautiful greens. Next slide, please. This is on the slough. We are now at Selby Lake on the gates of the Arctic National Park, north of the Arctic Circle. And so this is the Brooks Range, mountains of the Brooks Range, and the northern shore of Selby Lake. And you can see this is black spruce, which grow in very difficult conditions, lots of permafrost, wet, boggy areas. They tend to be very small. And this whole flat area between the lake and the mountains was wetlands. And it was an extraordinary environment. Next slide, please. And this, when I got there, there was a forest fire. Next slide, please. Across the lake. Fortunately, this fire only encompassed a couple of hundred acres, I would say. Next slide, please. But sort of typical. This is in the end of June, at the sort of the height of the dry season. Next slide, please. We were lucky in that the smoke didn't come across the lake, so the air quality, next slide, please, never affected us. But these are the mountains that are on the east side on the west side of the lake.
Was anybody fighting the fire, or was it just?
No, they monitor the fire, but that's sort of also part of the management up there, and the management in most of the parks is that you allow the fires to burn unless they're threatening a building. And most of these fires, as this one was, are ignited by dry lightning. Next slide, please. There was some beautiful colors that came out of these smokes. Next slide, please. I think this is the image that we saw at the beginning, but this is the main lodge, the north end of the lake, the Brooks Range in the back. You can see that the Brooks Range here at the end of June doesn't have any snow on it. The Brooks Range, although it's very, very cold, doesn't get very much precipitation. Next slide, please. This is the cache that's about a 16 by 16 building that's up on these 3-foot posts. And this was a building that we jacked up and we replaced all these wooden posts. One of the things that is challenging there is, in terms of construction, is the permafrost. And then secondly, is that the only way into this is by small bush plane, which can't carry concrete or rocks or bricks. And so the foundation of choice is wood. And as a result, you have to replace your foundation every once in a while. And so that's what we were doing in this project. We also rebuilt these stairs. Next slide, please. This is the sourdough cabin that I lived in for most of the time that I was at Selby Lake. This was built by a Eskimo, which is the word that they used there, named Charlie Sheldon. That was his English name. In 1971, Charlie married a woman named B Sheldon, and Charlie died around 79, and the land came to her. This land, this is on 20 acres on the lake that Charlie got as part of the Native Allotment Settlement in 1971. Each person was able to pick 160 acres in not more than 5 lots. And so Charlie picked this 20-acre lot. And the deal was that you had to pick a lot that you had some kind of experience or relationship with. And so Charlie had hunted and trapped in this area as a boy. He grew up about 50 miles away. Next slide, please. This was 10 feet wide by 14 feet long. This is Selby Lake, and sort of typical of the mountains immediately around it. This is on the east side of the lake. So my cabin was over here. And I looked down and saw this. These mountains tended to be about 4,000 or 5,000 feet high. The elevation of the lake was pretty low. It was only a couple of hundred feet. The lake was clean enough to drink out of, which is really rare. It wasn't contaminated with Giardia. Next slide, please.
What is Giardia?
What is it?
Giardia?
It is an intestinal bacteria that you don't want to get it. And it's really common. It's become common in most wild waters. Next slide. Sort of interesting wetlands and grassy areas and the mountains in the background. Next slide, please. Sort of typical of the geometry of those are white spruce trees. They're a little bit bigger. This is a point that separates the northern part of the lake from the southern part of the lake. Next slide, please. The lake would at times get really choppy. The wind came up and down this valley, and was quite changeable. This was the canoe that I used. Next slide, please.
Do the folks that own this place stay here year-round?
No, this is a summer only. They can come up in the winter. Next slide, please. That's part of the Brooks Range. That's black spruce. Look how skinny these are. This is looking south, and between these bit of woods, and there's actually tundra in there, and those, they call them hills, those are called the Lockwood Hills, is the Kobuk River Valley, which is an absolute pure wilderness river in this northern section of it. There are a couple of little towns, and it runs to the ocean. And the Kobuk River is famous for sheefish, which get up to 60 pounds and are an important protein for native peoples. This is the view out of my cabin window. Next slide, please. This is the outhouse and I rebuilt the roof. Next slide, please.
Does anybody grow gardens around?
No, not up in this area. This is the creek that I got all of my drinking water from up at Selby Lake area. It always ran perfectly cold, perfectly clear. One of the things that was quite different is that here, when we get a heavy rain, you always notice that the brooks and streams, and particularly the river, get silty. We had very heavy rains towards the third week in July, the river came up a lot and it wasn't silty at all. And I think it's reflective of the fact that the water was coming from a wholly undisturbed environment above it. And that not only was it undisturbed, but that it had never been disturbed. And one of the things I noticed, next slide please, is that the ground was different than our grounds. It was all lumpy and spongy and full of organic material. And you know, there's like just generations and generations of trees that had fallen and died and rotten. And it created like this peat moss or humus-like layer that was many feet thick and very, very lumpy. And the other thing that I noticed, this is like a just homemade ladder. Next slide, please. Maybe it'll show up in one of these pictures. This is the roof structure that I built. These are spruce logs that I cut and peeled and then put lichen on the roof on top of the roofing paper, which was on top of the boards. Next slide, please. I'll get to that thought about the soil. This was a little like fairy house that I built with the refuse from demoing the old roof. Another detail of the roof. And this is the front door of my cabin. Next slide, please. And this is the interior. This is a wood stove. And there was a little like wash basin. And this is the kitchen table, which was my desk.
Next. Is there a bathtub in the corner there?
This is the futon that I slept on. The sort of a little kitchen, the 2-burner gas. Next slide, please. The ceiling was only 6.5 feet high. This is the 7-foot wide picture window that looks south onto the lake. Next slide, please. Another shot of the outhouse. Next slide, please. And the cabin and the lake. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. That's a downloaded shot. But we had nesting bald eagles across the lake. And I was the beneficiary of an eagle that had hit a lake trout, and then somehow the lake trout got away. And it was during that period when I was alone and I'm starting to run out of food. As I was walking up the lake trail, I saw this fish, and it was still breathing. You know, the gills were still moving. And I'm like, oh, that's fabulous. So I just grabbed it and took it out, and I saw the wounds that looked like talon marks. And so I assumed that that's what had happened, that the fish had just escaped, but it was a mortal wound. And so I just filleted this and cut out the wounds, and I had 2 excellent fillets. This is about a 20-inch lake trout. Next slide, please. So I had unexpected visitors while I was there alone. And there was these 3 guys that flew in, and they knew Art, one of the guys that owns the cabin. And they said, oh, you're not Art. And I said, oh, he's not here. And they go, oh, we promised to stop in if we ever came here. But they came for like a 24-hour fishing expedition out of Fairbanks. And 2 of the guys were from Texas. And he was taking these Texans up to go fishing into the wilderness of Alaska. And so I said, oh, you know, I'm kind of running out of food. And they said, oh, well, you know, if we have any leftover food tomorrow when we fly out, we'll stop in and leave you what we got. I go, oh, that'd be great. And so I was out in the canoe the next day when they flew in and flew out. And then I came back and I saw this black plastic bag on the kitchen table. I'm like, oh, I had visions of potatoes and carrots and onions, and could I possibly dream wine or beer? And so I opened it up with all these grand expectations, and this is what was in there. And so then, and this gets to be a little bit of a longer story, but what I ended up doing was documenting all of the brands and all of the ingredients and the nutritional values. And I will say that on a more serious note, that I do think that this is one of the issues in American health and in American food, is that these are not intrinsically the kinds of foods that we need to maintain our health. And it is my view that if we're ever going to have health care that is both good and affordable and available to everyone who truly needs it, that ultimately we're going to have to become a healthier society and just demand less of these services. And one of the ways that is a strategy for getting to that healthier place is through better, cleaner food. I'm going to stop at that point, but I could go on. At any rate, next. So, next. This is, so I wore this from when I arrived in Manly on July 7th until about the third week in July. And as I wrote over the room with the hat and the net, and not one shirt, but two shirts, because one shirt the mosquitoes would go through, long pants, socks, boots, gloves, you had to have the gloves, that I was able to work outside without difficulty around mosquitoes. In the absence of any one of those pieces, the mosquitoes were really rough, and the alternative was to use DEET sprays, which I just didn't want to use, and I wanted to see if I could function without the sprays and what it would take, and this is what it took. Next slide, please. I built this stairway, and at the first high water, this was completely destroyed. Next. This is foam that came up on the lake, on the shore one day, and I was thinking, how bad can this stuff be? I mean, there's nothing here to pollute anything. So, and then I started thinking about what they call like a micro cuisine or molecular cuisine, right? And they had these foams. And I'm like, wow, that's cool. And so I ate some. And the first taste was a little bit like soap. But that might have just been the way it looked. And the second taste, I realized the aftertaste was more like ferns. And it just turns out to be organic material that's part of the background. This didn't happen very often, but this top part was, brown. It was like caramelized. It was kind of cool. At any rate, next, I just could not get enough of this view. Next slide, please. There's the stairs that we rebuilt. This is Margaret, and Margaret was a retired school teacher and a friend of Damaris, Art and Damaris. Along with B. Sheldon, owned the lodge, and she was up there for 2 weeks at the beginning of the first parts of July. Margaret was an excellent fisherwoman, and we went fishing together and had great fun. She had taught at a tiny school in a tiny village that was populated almost entirely by Russian old believers. So Alaska, of course, has a Russian tradition. It was founded by Russians. And there were these Russian old believers that have a very traditional sense of religion and of the Bible, and they have lots of rules, and it's very strict. And she taught in that school. And I will say that as I mentioned earlier, that I really went to Alaska without an agenda to change people's mind or to advocate for my own views. I really went there to hear what other people had to say and think, and to be open to them and to be respectful to them. And this was one time when I pushed back a little bit. And as Margaret was talking about her teaching experience with the old believers and how conservative it was, and Margaret was also a Pentecostal person, religionist. And so I said to her, and just by the way, maybe some of you know, my academic background is in the biological sciences. And so I said, well, did you teach evolution by natural selection? And she goes, no. And I said, well, so you were a public school teacher being paid by the state in a public school, and those public school kids did not get what is generally viewed as the foundational idea to the entire discipline of biology. And she goes, that's right. and so, you know, I left it, and then she went on to say, she goes, well, they didn't want their kids to be taught evolution, and I didn't want to teach it. And so that was really the end of the story. But it was fascinating for me to hear that and to imagine that. I will say that this kind of conversation in various forms repeated itself in various ways over my 4 months in Alaska. And I think it's really good to get out of your own silo. I mean, frankly, most of the people I know and are with more or less think like I do. And not completely, but you know, there's a lot of symmetry there. And it's commonly said that so many people just sort of associate with people who are like-minded. And as a result of that, for people that have very different views of the world, we often don't know each other and don't talk with each other or don't understand each other or appreciate each other or maybe even respect one another. And I really was interested in changing that in my own experience. And Margaret became a dear friend. One of the things I think that's absolutely essential to recall is that although Margaret had, in my view, an antithetical notion about evolution, she was an absolutely lovely human being in every way that you might imagine. And we had wonderful time fishing together. Next slide, please. This is Damaris Martved, an absolutely lovely, lovely human being. One of the things that was fascinating about Damaris and Margaret and Bee is that Damaris is in her early 70s. I would say Margaret was also in her early 70s. Bee was in her early 80s. These three women were strong. They could walk easily on rough trails. They could bend. They could lift. I was really taken by the grace of their aging and their continued ability to be physically active and to be engaged in life and be interested in doing things. Damaris and Margaret were great, great friends. They had met each other as young women teaching in the bush. This is Damaris's husband, Art, and he is filleting fish. Lovely guy, an adventurer. He has been to the North Pole and to the South Pole and to many, many remote places all over the world, mostly in his own small airplane, helping other people to access those remote places, often scientists. Next slide, please. Just couldn't get enough of this view. Next slide, please. Next slide. This is directly across. This is where the eagles were nesting. Next slide, please.
Is that your photo?
Yep. Yep.
That's excellent.
Yeah, that's my next slide. This is looking south to the Lockwood Hills. Those are the Lockwood Hills and the Kobuk River Valley in between. Next slide, please. This is the work that we did shoring up the cache with the new foundation wood. Next slide, please. This is what we did. There was all this like ridiculous stuff that was like of no use that was underneath the cache. You have to remember there's no place to put anything and it's not very practical to fly stuff out. And so I suggested that they create a dump. And so this was the dump, which they covered with visqueen. Next slide, please. This was his snow machine that he had to put all this stuff on top of because otherwise the bears would come and just rip the snow machine apart and rip up the seat and stuff. So you had the bears were constantly, next slide please, yes?
I have a question about the dump.
Yeah.
So did they have any kind of consciousness about using things and then what happens as a result of things staying around in their space?
The consciousness that they had, which was, you know, let's save this and maybe it'll be useful some other time. And sometimes that was true. That seemed to be why, it was part of this wilderness ethic. Hey, it was a lot of work or cost to get this stuff in here. I don't want to just throw this out. So, we saved 7 broken shovels that, had been broken for 20 years or more. Next slide, please. This is Tony's cabin. This was a fishing camp that Tony was also an Eskimo man, and he had a private allotment in what became the national park. He sold this to the national park. Next slide, please. Was not in great shape. This is the view from Tony's. I canoed. This is about 2 miles down the lake. I canoed here for a day and then hiked up and had a lovely day on my own. Next slide, please. This is a view from hiking up near Tony's cabin. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. This is the blueberries. This is a view from near where near the top of where I got to. Next slide. Looking the other way, away from the lake. Here's these wetlands and other water features from this high ridge in the northern part of the lake. The lodge is down here. There's 2 creeks that come in. This is looking south. You can sort of see the 2 different sections of the lake. You don't see it well, but in the distance is the Kobuk Valley. So you can see the lake is long and thin, and in between these 2 big ridges of mountains. Next slide, please. Next, very austere. Not much growth there. Yes.
Is this all parkland?
Yes, this is all a part of Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve. We're technically in the preserve part. Self-portrait. Next slide, please. Here I am paddling back from Tony's at the end of the day. This is about 9:30, 10 o'clock at night at the end of July. Next slide, please. This is the first time I saw the moon in 2 months. Next, one of the things that's sort of odd is that you don't see stars or the moon because it's daylight all the time. This is the bush plane that got us in and out. This is Art's plane. Next slide, please. This is how I wash my clothes. Next slide, please. It's just hot water. This is B. Sheldon. B is the word will come to me. The widow of Charlie Sheldon, who owned this land and built this cabin, and then B helped Art and Damaris build the lodge. We lifted up this cabin. These logs were all down in the dirt. The cabin was built in '71, so it was starting to really compromise the logs. So we jacked it up and as high as we could, and I put stone. I lined the whole perimeter with stone to try to keep the wood up off the ground, and then I raked away leaves and dust and needles as a way to try to keep the moisture off of the wood. Next slide, please. This was a rotten piece, so we repaired this. Then they put in some insulation, which then will get a treatment that will seal that. Next slide, please. This is the desk that I worked at, and this is one of my postcards from Alaska that I was getting ready to mail. The mail only went out twice during the time I was at Selby Lake. This is where I slept. Next slide, please. This is where I heated the water to wash. And next slide, please. I didn't cook here. This is just part of this kitchen. Next slide, please. This is sort of showing the density, and I think there's a next slide, of the ground cover, no it doesn't, around this this natural forest, this unbroken, untrammeled forest. It was really quite lovely. And it's incredibly lush. It was lush like the rainforest. Only this place only grows about 8 weeks a year. Yet it had that kind of vigor and intensity and thickness. It was almost impenetrable walking. Next slide, please. And this is a sunset shot. Next slide. Another sunset shot. And another. Just a beautiful, beautiful place. Absolutely quiet. Next slide, please. Wetlands to the north of the lake. Next slide, please. Now, this is a hike that I took to the north end of the lake, and I went up this ridge. And most of the way, but not all of the way, the ridge had that openness that I was able to travel. A boletus mushroom, there was a lot of those. Next slide, please. And up at the top of the ridge, I'm now looking to the north and east, and there's this extensive valley that runs east and west. So the Brooks Range is on the north side of that, and then these mountains, which are part of the Brooks Range, but there's this central valley, and there's, of course, there's a big river that runs through there.